Hello, everyone. Welcome to ARA Boston's Ask Me Anything session. This is the first session that we're doing. We're going to do this once a month. I see some familiar names and faces, some not familiar, but hello, everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself or show your face, say hello, or ask a question. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm the head instructor of the online atelier. And yeah, how are you all doing? Happy New Year. Hey,
Happy New Year, Eric.
So
I
good
have
to
a
see
foot
you.
of snow where I am right now.
a foot of snow?
Yes.
Oh goodness. We got a little dusting here.
Eric, how do we start? Or do we just raise our hand or chat?
You can raise your hand or just ask away.
Okay, I got a question now, and you don't have to answer this one. It's a little bit dated, but a few years ago, you mentioned taking a landscape painting class on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, and you were just talking about it generally in such glowing terms. I wonder if you could just give us a few comments about the highlights in terms of what you learned about landscape painting.
When I was studying plein air landscape painting, I think one of the most interesting things that I learned is that contrary to the way that I had experience painting in the studio, I couldn't quite hit the actual notes of nature in the way that I could in a studio controlled lighting, still life, or a portrait. But instead, there was a degree of idealization or a kind of a best try, best effort when it came to mixing up the colors and choosing a satisfactory value or hue relationship. For example, your lead white and your cadmium yellow and whatever other high chromatic or vibrant colors will never quite match the intensity and vibrancy of the sun. For example, if we're painting a sunset. Instead, everything needs to be keyed down to a relationship that works in paint. I, before that, had not experienced such, painting, trying to really do my best on a plein air painting with the full effulgence of the sun and capturing all those notes of nature. But instead, I discovered and I learned that a degree of idealistic interpretation is necessary to capture the light effect, as opposed in the studio, where you can sometimes get caught up and you can sometimes get very skilled just hitting the exact color and value that you have, that you physically see with your eyes. But when you're plein air painting, when you're out there in nature, the brightness of the grass, sometimes you can't get your paint to look that vibrant or that bright. When in the studio, when you're using like a north light or some sort of artificial light, the intensity of that light is just so much lower that it is sometimes more possible to hit that exact color. When I was doing the landscape painting, I was trying my best to do as little idealistic interpretation as possible and playing God as little as I possibly could in terms of actually doing any compositional shifts. If there's a pole there, if there's a garbage can there, I would paint the garbage can or paint the pole and try to match the value and color relationships or angular relationships or proportional relationships, because I was in a place or coming from it from a perspective of learning. So until I felt that I had successfully mastered those fundamental skills, I didn't even want to take out the ugly garbage can or the barn that's falling over, but instead just copy it as it appears. And that I think is an admirable thing and a proper thing to do. But at the same time, as much as I was trying to do what was there, there was a certain degree that could not be achieved without the artistic interpretation or slight idealization in order to get it very close to what it visually resembles. It's somewhat impressionistic type of impressionistic leaning type of painting, as opposed to a more romanticism or some highly realized painting. Instead, more painterly, more highly colored approach.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Becky, I see that you have your hand raised. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's so good to see you.
So good to see
I've
you.
missed seeing you.
I apologize. I've been a bit of a, I've fallen into a bit of a hermitage for the past couple of years, just doing some personal emotional healing after the loss of my father. But I am by the time that I fall out of my hermitage.
I'm sorry you lost your father, and I totally understand that, going through similar things, that I kind of took a back step too, but I'm back in it again.
Good.
My question is, speaking of death, I'm going to be using my uncle's ashes in painting a painting of his mother, and was wondering any advice on using human ashes. My thought was to maybe mix it in with some lead white as an underpainting in the eyes, and then do a blue glaze on her eyes, or just any advice you have or thoughts you have on using human ashes, incorporating them into the painting of his mother. Not a lot. I mean, I have a quarter cup, but I'm only going to use like just a tiny bit.
I don't know exactly how to answer that fully, or I don't know how to give you the best advice possible. Primarily because I've never painted with human ashes. But secondarily, that I'm unaware archivally of what chemistry-wise may happen with those human ashes, whether or not the individual was like embalmed. I don't know how compatible, just like we have some pigments that do funny things and aren't compatible when they are in oil compared to like a water-based medium. I'm unsure how that will translate, or if there would be any kind of efflorescence or any type of things that could cause problems later. So I don't know exactly how to answer, and I don't know exactly how to answer that one. I think that keeping it minimal is good, and doing some research, see if anybody else has done that, possibly even reaching out to Tatiana and Georgia Hanlon just to get some idea from them, because maybe they would know a little bit better how proper that would be to mix into your oil painting, or whether or not to use it kind of just as a exterior or end type layer, as opposed to having it earlier in the painting. And if anything happens, you don't want those beautiful final layers to delaminate if that human ash layer has any incompatibilities with the acidity of the oil, or incompatibilities with even some of your other pigments.
Okay, that's very, the only stuff I found on is I found people who were painting pets with ashes, but they were like just goobing it on for the background. And I kind of saw I could see some future horror with that. So I just wanted to implement just a tiny bit, just to say her ashes or his ashes are in his mom's painting. So just maybe a few morsels here and there, but I will approach Tatiana and George and ask them also. And I thank you. And it's so wonderful.
The wonderful thing too. I think that so long as it's small, it's the same thing with all of those wonderful, amazing mediums and historical recipes that we have available to us painting wise, where using things like Marigé medium, black oil can be downright disastrous if they're used too liberally throughout layers of your painting. But if you use a little bit of it for like a few details, your whole painting's not going to fall apart. So I think that so long as, regardless, so long as it's minimal, and I would probably advise doing it in a layer that doesn't get painted over with lots of thin or glaze-like layers, just in case if something bad happens, it's at the surface of the painting, but not buried behind work that you really like and care about. Okay, Robert. Oh, I see some people are putting, thank you, Nicole. Robert's got a question. When it comes to, and you all are welcome to put questions that you have in the chat as well. If you'd like to raise your hand to let me know that you've got a question. If you're using a PC or a Mac, there's a little smiley face with a little plus sign down on the bottom. If you click that, you'll see a thing that says raise your hand. If you do that, then I'll know to talk to you next. But Robert's put in the chat, when it comes to the fat over lean rule in oil painting, I know that it pertains to the oil content increasing with subsequent layers. Does the thickness of paint come into it too? In other words, could I apply thicker amounts of plain oil paint initially and then apply layers which contain more oil, or would that not be recommended? Robert, that's a wonderful question. And I've got good information to actually simplify the whole process. The whole fat over lean rule, as I understand it, and from a great majority of research, there's quite a few of my atelier students and previous students in here, which already know the entire conversation happening because I've said it. I preach it so many times, but when it comes to the fat over lean principle, it's a little bit, the understanding of it is a little bit flawed because there's just, there wasn't good information beforehand, and now there's so much kind of half-baked misinformation just promulgated on the internet. This would be the best advice that I can give regarding the fat over lean principle. The fat over lean principle could be restated as more flexible over less flexible. So it really, in your painting, you should not ideally have layers that are excessively generous in oil. So what we're talking about is the pigment volume concentration. It is that we're gonna take quite a few tangents here. I want you to imagine a baker opens up a new bakery, puts a sign, "We've got the bread with the most flour in it." How ridiculous would you look at this? Of course, you can only have so much flour in bread before it's just an unworkable mass. It's no longer bread. Many oil paint manufacturers will say that they have the most pigmented paint. And at that, all of the paint manufacturers are going to make paint at the critical pigment volume concentration. Critical pigment volume concentration. That is the equivalent of, when you're making bread, the correct ratio of, let's say, water and flour to make bread. Or in terms of like a brick mason, how much water to mortar dust would make a good mortar to lay brick foundation. If there was too much water, or if there was too much powdered mortar, then the wall will become brittle and liable to fall over and break. So the best advice that I could give in an indirect painting, of course, fat over lean, what this really means to me is that we're speaking about a multi-layered indirect painting where there's possibly an imprimatura or a campitura, a tone, an underpainting, perhaps in lead white or some other colors. And then you use subsequent colored layers of paint or impasto to glaze over whatever it may be, but you're building up all of those layers of paint. It would be best and most proper for every single layer of that paint to have a similar pigment volume concentration. What that means is the amount of pigment to oil based on each paint, because of course, each paint, each pigment absorbs more or less oil. So for example, raw umber, burnt umber, yellow ochre, raw sienna, burnt sienna, they're all essentially clay-based pigments that have more or less mixture of minerals, manganese, iron oxides in them to give them their color and to result in a speed in which they dry. For example, raw umber, burnt umber are going to dry way faster than raw or burnt sienna or yellow ochre. Now, where that becomes pertinent information is lead white absorbs very little oil. So it's ridiculous. When you're trying to make lead white from pigment and oil, one drop can turn the whole batch of paint to almost like a puddle because it absorbs so little. Meanwhile, when you make burnt or raw umber from pigment into oil paint, you just keep pouring oil into it again and again. So the pigment volume concentration, the amount of oil that would cause lead white to be a perfect workable paste, is going to be different quantity of oil than, let's say, raw or burnt umber. What is important is that critical pigment volume concentration, which is where if you imagine my fist is a pigment, just enough oil to surround that pigment totally with oil. That is an ideal paint viscosity or ideal pigment volume concentration. It would be best, your paintings will age best if you keep that consistent throughout the entire painting. Now, unfortunately, we're all human and we have creativity, we have experience, and there are so many variables that go into a painting. For example, impasto, thicker layers, thinner layers, adding transparent pigments as amendments to get around glazing. For example, if you're going to glaze, the majority of information out there will encourage you. So maybe some linseed oil, maybe some stand oil with turpentine and Damar varnish, some of this, some of that. The list will go on and on about these mediums that you can add into your paint. I think it would be most proper if you have any paint that is too thick to actually amend that paint before you start painting to get it to just that right viscosity or pigment volume concentration before you paint. Now, let's go back to glazing. Most information out there will encourage you, add oil to make your paint transparent. Adding oil takes those pigment particles and it separates them apart, which essentially is going to make it look more transparent because there's less opacity because those pigments are tightly packed next to each other. Now, you add extra oil, you add extra fat. This is where the fat over lean principle becomes just a little bit flawed. Adding oil inevitably will increase the amount of yellowing and darkening and brittleness of your paint film, of that layer of paint that you painted very oily. It will be brittle, it'll yellow, and it is liable to darken. Now, with those things in mind, how can you glaze without adding all that extra oil? And that is where a little bit of knowledge of what the refractive index of your pigments are compared to your oil can come in really handy. For example, I don't mean to throw a bunch of like strange terms, but I'll explain them all. The refractive index in this lane, very simply described, think of it this way. The refractive index of glass and oil are very similar, making a very transparent paint. The refractive index of titanium dioxide, titanium white, and oil are very different, which makes your titanium white a very opaque pigment. So what you can do is you can use amendments, or you can use transparent pigments like crystal leaded powdered glass, just regular crystal glass, powdered glass, sand, silica, calcium carbonate, barium sulfate, barite, all which have varying levels of opacity or transparency. You add that almost as a paste or as a transparent paint to amend your paint, making it more transparent. And that will allow you to actually paint in semi-impasto manners, laying down thick layers of paint that is transparent, that will look like almost a stained glass, as opposed to a overly oily stain on the surface. So it would be better to keep that pigment volume concentration go the same from layer to layer. It's also very, 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 I would really stress this, very important that each of your layers of paint have enough time to dry. Because remember, it's not fat over lean that we're really going for. It is more flexible over less flexible. I'll give you an example. If I assume many of you have painting experience, so I apologize for those of you that don't. I'll try to add information that'll be pertinent to it. But if you were to do an underpainting in alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and titanium white, you can expect your underpainting to take an unbelievable amount of time to dry, right? Has anybody used alizarin crimson or ultramarine blue or titanium white, and over and over you've touched the painting and it just won't seem to dry? Now, because that layer takes a long time to dry, you would need to wait a very long time to dry, for it to dry, before you should even paint over it. God forbid you do something like that and then put something like burnt or raw umber or some very fast drying paint over it while that layer is still taking time to dry. That is a big source of causing mechanical failures, causing your paint to essentially crack. So it would be most proper to use faster drying pigments or colors in the earliest layers of your painting. And if you're going to use slower drying pigments or colors, it would be a little bit better if you're painting all the time. You know, you've got your studio, you're painting at least 5 days a week. My suggestion is have more paintings going, or, you know, spread it out. If you're letting your painting dry for a month in between it, you can just paint on it with whatever, and it should be pretty fine. But if you're waiting 2 to 3 days, you'd really do have to get a bit strategic with what pigments you're using earlier and what pigments you use later, so that your later layers do not dry faster than your earlier layers, because that is what causes a big amount of cracking. For example, imagine an area that was a lake, the lake dries up and you're left with just this bog or all of this mud. The sun comes out, it bakes the top layer of that mud. And then after a few days, that top layer of mud starts to crack because there's still wet mud underneath. That's the equivalent of you doing thick impasto with a relatively slow drying paint, or not allowing that impasto to successfully cure and dry, and doing, you know, let's say mixtures of raw umber and cobalt blue, both relatively fast drying paints. Those dried before that underlayer, that underpainting impasto has had the opportunity to really come to a nice hard full dry on the inside, not just touch dry, but deep inside the paint. Once that has dried, then it would be good to paint on top of that. Robert, I apologize for the long-winded answer, a little complicated of a simple situation, but complicated at the same time. But I hope that that answers your question successfully. You're welcome. Okay, who do we have next? Nancy, how does Vermilion differ from cadmium red light? I'm doing a master copy painting and I'm wondering if I should try to use it, if I can find it anywhere. goodness, I understand your dilemma, especially if you're really wanting to use genuine vermilion, which is a mercuric sulfide based pigment. How does it differ? You'll have to feel it, you'll have to see it to really tell. I've turned one by one, I've turned students that I know are interested in portraiture of my own onto genuine vermilion, because the handling of it is just magnificent and magical compared to the handling of cadmium red light. Cadmium red light is very chromatic and it's a big bully. I mean, how many painters in here have accidentally touched that cad red light just a little too hard and just ruined their entire mixture?
Yeah,
right?
scrape it off. Yep.
Exactly. Vermilion is more subtle. Its tinting strength is a bit lower. Its opacity is a little bit lower. Its vibrancy is not nearly as vibrant as cad red. Not as vibrant. Usually not as bright, not as orange, or not as chromatic as that cadmium red light. I find the vermilion to be much easier to manage. You know, I can grab some with my paintbrush and keep mixing. I don't have to like, you know, clutch my pearls while I grab any cadmium red. Of course, when you need that vibrancy, when you need that intensity, you should definitely opt to use that cadmium red. For example, in the online atelier, we did a demo of a still life painting, and there was we were doing glazing on this red fabric. For that, the cadmium red light, medium, or even the deep were great choices. Meanwhile, if I was doing a portrait or if I was doing a relatively classical looking portrait or figure, I definitely rely more on the vermilion. They both dry very slow, and they both can be amended to decrease their tinting strength if you use some sort of transparent pigment to add into it, like calcium carbonate, barytes, powdered glass, things along those lines, can even manipulate the way the paint handles. Even if all you can get is the cadmium red, I like to amend my cadmium red almost at a 50-50 ratio if I'm using it for something like portrait, just to decrease the tinting strength of it. Plus, I'm a big fan of using crystal leaded powdered glass in my paint. And I think that those little slightly larger glass particles add something really beautiful in the dynamic of having larger and smaller pigment particles in a painting, and the way that interacts with the visual light of the viewer that's actually seeing it, compared to cadmium red, which has a very uniform and small pigment particle size, very similar to the way that you've got titanium white, which also has a very small and uniform pigment particle size. If you ever get the chance, I would even recommend trying to find a natural cinnabar as opposed to a vermilion, which a vermilion is typically going to be synthetic mercuric sulfide, as opposed to cinnabar, which is the natural mineral form of it, which has variations in pigment particle size, both very ancient pigments, which I think definitely have their place on the palette. But in today's world, a little expensive and difficult to find, so they are a bit precious. Nancy, does that answer your question pretty good? Do you have any others? Okay, Jean Keller. To follow up on the amount of oil and pigment, my question is about mediums. I just picked up some oleo gel and some pale drying oil. Can you speak about how to use these properly? And by using or adding mediums, does this affect the fat over lean or fat/lean as well? I would only be adding things like oleo gel or the pale drying oil. The pale drying oil actually has a cicative in it. The pale grinder's oil is a high acid linseed oil. The higher the acid, generally speaking, the faster it's going to dry. So the pale drawing does have a cicative in it. I think on natural pigments, the way that they put it is a scientific edition of dryers, which essentially is a very well thought out small amount of those dryers, because by having too much of those dryers in your paint, sometimes it can, it can cause your paint to never dry. Oil paint manufacturers usually have a team, like a whole section, if they're going to have dryers in their paint, that knows the chemistry and studies, because every paint, every pigment will require different dryers or a different quantity of dryers to equalize or bring that drying time up to be a more, what the paint manufacturer would consider as more reasonable. I personally avoid ciccatives in dryers to the best of my ability, especially metallic ciccatives. But that's really just me. I personally don't like the idea of ever having more oil than I need. So if I am hung up, I've got a painting that needs to be done soon, I have a deadline, or I just want to speed up my entire painting process. My suggestion, if you're going to add mediums, oils, beyond, or let me back up there. If you're wanting to add specific mediums, let's say you really want to make room for vacuum bodied linseed oils or stand oils, you want to make room for some type of oil because you feel that it adds some sort of handling property or physical nature to your paint. That's proper. That's great. The thing that you have to avoid is going too far with that oil to where you're now painting with a soupy and oily paint that will take a long time to dry. It would be better to maybe put your paint on a piece of paper, just like printer paper or acid-free paper, something to suck the oil out so that you can replace that oil. Now, many times, how many times have you went to squeeze out paint and you get this goopy paint, and what seems like somebody just throws like a bucket of oil at your palette? That usually leads to your paint being a little bit leaner and stiffer later in the tube. That I actually like, especially since I use paint without stabilizers. I use I either paint that I've made myself or paint from natural pigments, just because there's no stabilizers, no additives. I know it's just pigment and oil. That's really great, because when I get a tube that's now gotten really stiff to where I try to squeeze it out and there's no way that I can paint with it, it's an opportunity for me to use as much of the oleo gel, as much of the vacuum bodied linseed oil, or whatever other type of oil, to modify the working properties or the transparency or opacity. But if you have a paint that's already really good quantity of oil, you may not even need to put anything into it. I'm a big fan of choosing your palette to speed or slow down your drying time as well, as opposed to relying on mediums to do that. Although there are ones that you can definitely use.
So can oleo gel, can you swap that out like as if you were going to use linseed oil, or not? Really?
Absolutely. But the oleo gel,
thicker. It's like a, well,
it's almost nearing the paste, isn't it? Paste or gel. So what oleo gel is a mixture of fumed silica or pyrogenic silica and linseed oil at a 70-30 ratio. That's 30%. This is by weight, not by volume. 30% fumed silica, 70% linseed oil. Mix those together. Fumed silica it's essentially what happens when you take sand or silica and superheat it to the point where it just shatters into unbelievably small pigment particle sizes. Because of that, it doesn't really have a grit. It's very smooth, gel feeling paint. that will add oil to your paint because, of course, it's 70% oil, but it will also add more transparency to your paint. Because of the small pigment particle size or just the nature of the pigments in the oil together, it also gives your paint a little bit more of a thixotropic quality. In other words, if you were to add straight linseed oil, your paint may be liable to get a little soupy. Have you ever accidentally added too much oil? Then it's like you're dealing with a puddle. Meanwhile, it's an expensive color and you don't want to have to add more paint. So you kind of just deal with it being a little bit soupy. I like the oleo gel because that doesn't happen quite as easily. It's easier to grab itsy bitsy bits of that oleo gel and amend my paints correctly. But I do almost all of that amending of my paint before I start painting. If every single demo, every single painting that I do, I still make all of the students sit there and watch me have this conversation with my paint. This one has just the right amount of oil, or this one is too stiff. I need to add oil. I'm going to add stand oil because I want my burnt or raw umber to dry slower. And stand oil or vacuum bonded linseed oil has a low acid value, low acid content. So that will help make my burnt or raw umber not dry on my palette before I've even had the chance to use it all. So I think approaching, very logically and practically, what you're putting in your paint and doing that beforehand. So you can just actually focus on painting as opposed to dipping into this, dipping into that, grabbing this, grabbing that, and then having a heart attack in a month when you read that now that's the worst possible thing that you could ever put in your paint. You know the feeling?
This is great.
Please, next question, please comment on Liquin. Liquin, its uses and its pros and cons. Thank you. Liquin, to simplify, Liquin is essentially an alkyd-based medium. That's an alkyd resin, which requires some solvent, which is why Liquin kind of smells a little bit like spray paint, is what you're smelling is that solvent, which dissolves that alkyd resin. I think that the most proper uses of Liquin, once again, is small quantities mixed into your big piles of paint, but not your little mixtures, but your big piles of paint consistently, with the exceptions of the fast-drying pigments like raw, burnt umber, cobalt blue, Prussian blue. Those need no help. They will dry all by themselves with the correct pigment volume concentration of just regular linseed oil. I think when it comes to using alkyd-based mediums, that's going to be your liquins, your galkids, even your epoxide oils, which is an alkyd resin. It's a copolymerized linseed oil that Natural Pigments makes. It's linseed oil with a mixture. It's a blend of oils, which includes an alkyd resin that does not require a solvent to be dissolved. Now, when using alkyds, I think it's best to use them earlier in the painting if you're painting relatively frequently, because those alkyds are going to help the paint seize up, dry pretty hard, pretty quickly. It would be better that those are earlier in the painting as opposed to later in the painting. And this is where the manufacturers really are tricky, because you've got Liquin Detail, you've got Galkyd Light, you have all of these other type of mediums which almost encourage you to use very fast drying mediums at the end of your painting, as opposed to where you really want that fast drying to happen, which is in the beginning of the painting. Did that answer the question about liquid? Good. Okay. Would cadmium scarlet work as a substitute for vermilion? I think so. In the past, I've used cadmium scarlet as a I'm saying cadmium scarlet as a hue of a very orangey. Cadmium scarlet is essentially cad red light. One paint manufacturer's cad red light is another one's cad red regular. One paint manufacturer's cadmium yellow. Lemon is another paint manufacturer's cadmium yellow light. So you have to, I say this maybe a little open-endedly, but I do think that cadmium red scarlet is a decent alternative to the vermilion, especially if you're painting plein air, painting outdoors. When doing quicker drawings, Robert has another question. When doing quicker drawings, do you know of any shorthand techniques to turning of form? Ooh, that depends on your medium, and that depends on what you're going for. So when it comes to really highly realized, smooth, refined, rendered drawings, sometimes the correct answer really is the long one. That quality of form comes with a lot of precision and time, really smoothing out your transitions to give your form a sense of three-dimensionality. If you're doing quicker sketches, I think that going back in time and doing some research on hatching can be a very informative and quick, since we're really talking about haste here to get the form. I think that relying on linear notations which suggest the three-dimensionality or the form of what you're doing, combined with perhaps some rougher form, smooth type of rendering. If you couple that with hatching, the two blend together really well. But if you're only doing smooth type rendering, outside of using a brush, a sponge, or some way to actually make the value homogeneous, I think that relying on more graphic linear means can be a really good hatching and cross hatching, that is, can be a really quick and easy and instructive and kind of beautiful aesthetic way to achieve a sense of form. The light effect will oftentimes suffer a little bit for it, but when it comes to the light effect, that's usually where you'll need to expand your value range to the appropriate degree to really get enough contrast to make not only the form look round, but also the light seem to interact on it and illuminate that form that you're describing as well. Thomas asks, can you explain what ropey means in paint? Usually I hear it related to some whites. How and when or why is it used or desirable? Is that what we see in some Rembrandts? I know you're an expert on him. I'm not an expert on him. I just love him a whole lot and I've read a whole bunch on him, but I don't claim to be an expert on Rembrandt, but I will share whatever information that I do have regarding that ropey quality in paint. If you desire any sense of ropiness in your paint, a lot of that ropey quality comes from what pigment you're using and what oil are you suspending that pigment in. For example, lead white in a high acid linseed oil will have more of a body, more stiffness. Meanwhile, that same lead white bound in pure walnut oil or even safflower oil will just be soupy and ropey, to where you'll grab it and a string or a rope of paint will just kind of grip onto it, and just you'll have a Jackson Pollock painting all over your palette before you know it. It depends on what you're going. It really depends on what you're going for. If you want that ropiness in terms of textural variety in your painting, then you definitely want to choose paints without stabilizers. Paints with stabilizers would be your common manufactured paint, your paint that you get just from the store, all the common brands, which I won't call out or name, but the high majority of them are using aluminum stearate, magnesium stearate, and in Old Holland's case, hydrogenated castor oil, which is, of course, isn't a drying oil. which causes its own problems. Those stabilizers emulsify the oil and decrease the amount of sedimentation, which essentially when the pigment settles out of the oil, kind of like muddy water, the particulates will settle out of the water. Same thing happens in our paint. That's sometimes taken care of by adding in the stabilizers. The stabilizers significantly alter the working properties of the paint. It takes the individuality out of the actual paint, and it kind of homogenizes. It makes all of the paint kind of feel the same. For example, if you've never used lead white without a stabilizer, let's say lead white number 2, which is lead white in walnut oil, you'll know that that is significantly different than let's say the Kremnitz white or lead white that you would use from Old Holland or Windsor and Newton, where those lead whites are a little bit more buttery or a little bit stiff. But the real nature of the paint, it doesn't want to stand up on its own. It actually just wants to self-level and essentially become more soft and rounded. Typically, ropey paints are going to have that soft self-leveling property as well. You can add things like vacuum-bodied linseed oil to soften some of your paint to make it self-level and become, at times more ropey. Other times just to where you don't have to soften quite as much because the paint is not having that sharp brush texture. Instead, it's going to soften out and already be a smooth type of look. Now, some of the things that Rembrandt also was known for is putting glass in his paint and using calcium carbonate, which many Golden Age Baroque Dutch Flemish artists was pretty typical to use calcium carbonate, which calcium carbonate and linseed oil as a paste, that is also a very ropey color. You can add that into other paints that don't have a ropey quality to give them a ropey quality if that means something to you for impasto or just that the aesthetics, the look of your painting. You just have to keep in mind the calcium carbonate in oil will also decrease it's not very reactive. Very reactive pigments dry very fast. Pigments with a low reactivity will dry slower. Calcium carbonate in oil, it's not very reactive pigment, so it will slow some of the drying time down, and it will, of course, make your paint a little bit more transparent, but that may be exactly what you're looking for and going for. Next question. Did that answer your question, Thomas, by the way?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate it. That's a lot I'm going to have to process all of that.
Well, I am recording. I am also recording this meeting. I know the Zoom lady probably yelled at you all that this meeting is being recorded. But we are going to post this. So if I speak a little too fast, and if there are some things that I'm going faster than you can make notes, we are going to put this on our YouTube channel as well, and you can rewatch it. But yeah.
Would ropey be somewhat synonymous with stringy? In other words, the ability to take a brush and make a longer rope before it breaks?
Yep. And that typically ropey paint has a tendency to be long paint as well. The two descriptions kind of go hand in hand. Meanwhile, other paint is very short. So think of it this way. Have you ever used a raw umber? And the raw umber doesn't really want to spread around as easily without adding a little bit of mineral spirits or a little bit of extra oil, because those clay-based pigments are, when you make a paste out of it, they do resemble wet clay. They're generally a little bit shorter paint. So if you try to make a long brushstroke, the brushstroke will kind of break apart, which is sometimes really nice. For example, when you're doing a landscape painting and you want some sun-dappled light highlights across some water, you may actually want to take something like your lead white and add a medium to it or add an amendment to it to actually make it a shorter paint so that your brush strokes actually break apart as opposed to creating one long smear.
I see like a texture on a Rembrandt nose. It looks like the white was laid down sometimes, and the dark is filling in the crevices, like almost after the fact in some cases.
Yeah.
So that, but the white then didn't settle flat. It kept its body. That's why I'm a little confused on that, which way that goes.
One other unrelated, but unrelated to your question is that one also very important thing is that our paint and our varnishes shrink with time. So the volume, the intensity of that impasto is going to be biggest, grandest, and fluffiest when you paint it from now to the next month. But if you were to let that painting dry 10, 15 years, you may be able to see, those of you who've been painting for quite a while, you may be able to see some of your paint actually shrinking, because as our paint ages, it also shrinks, just like your varnish. How many of you have done varnish your painting, let's say with Gambar, and it looks great for the first week or two, and then a year rolls by and you look at it, you say, goodness, it doesn't even look like it's varnished anymore. It looks like it's sinking in again. That's usually because that layer of varnish is also shrinking, revealing more of the texture of the linen, which scatters the light. And that essentially causes it to look sunken in again. So when you are doing things like impasto, when you are analyzing things like a Rembrandt, you have to think about how many hundreds of years has it taken for that paint to even get as actually flat and as smooth as it has, because your paint definitely will be more thick when you paint it today, when you let it dry for a week, as opposed to 10, 20, 30, 40, or a few decades or centuries go by, that paint will continue to shrink. So you also have to keep in mind how you want your painting to look later on in life. And sometimes that's maybe even exaggerating some of that impasto, not a lot, but exaggerating it a little more. Because I've seen areas where I have little impasto on little details and everything, even after 7 or 8 years, it no longer has like any physical texture to it. It's actually become smooth, which is actually quite surprising.
Well, thank you very much, and also thank you for your school and doing this whole thing. I'm thrilled about it.
Oh, you're welcome. We're gonna do it every single month with all of the different instructors. So you'll get different. If you keep coming, you'll get slightly different answers. But we all share kind of a common core. But each of us has our own experience and individuality. So you'll get at times wildly different answers depending on who you talk to. So those of you who have already asked questions, I encourage you to ask the same questions, maybe even next time, and see what the different answer is, and look for just justification of that. And that's the kind of exciting thing. Some things are cut and dry. You know, when I talk about like the chemistry, like scientific side, I'm really trying my best to give you as proper and correct of an answer as I can to make your paintings last the test of time, like I want my paintings to last the test of time. When it comes to aesthetics and things like that, that's where you'll especially get some wildly different answers. So that's very exciting. Please comment on acrylic as an underpainting for oil. Don't. Use an oil ground. It would be best to use an oil ground for your oil painting and use just oil paint for your oil painting. There's just not really much of a need. If you use acrylic, if you're using an acrylic ground, meaning acrylic primed canvas or panel, and then you use acrylic as an underpainting, as either an imprimatur or campitura, which are either a transparent or a relatively opaque tone to get rid of that whiteness of the canvas. And then let's say you do like your full underpainting in acrylic because you want to do it and have it be dry within a few hours. There's some chance that the oil paint won't bond as well to that acrylic paint. For example, surfactants are used in making acrylic paint. If you are painting on a acrylic primed canvas or panel, whether someone else primed it or you primed it, it would be a really good idea to either use a damp rag or something with deionized or distilled water to wipe that canvas down if you're going to be oil painting on it, because those surfactants can kind of come to the surface and lead to mechanical failures. Your paint essentially delaminating or not really bonding as well to that layer. But best to just use oil, really. Chris says, hi, Eric, I would really love some advice and thoughts on using Galid and Liquin fine detail, especially in the underpainting and for transparent layers. What's your experience with it, if any? When I was a younger artist, I definitely used Galid. I used Liquin, and I had very limited use with the liquid fine detail, but the big difference between the Galid, the Liquin, and the Galid Light and the Liquin fine detail is essentially the viscosity of it. The regular Liquin and Galid are generally more sticky, stiff. Meanwhile, the fine detail and the Galid Light have a lower viscosity or more fluid. I think that it really comes down to your personal preference in terms of viscosity. How much flow do you really want your paint to have when you're working with it? And choosing to use whichever one of those you do for that personal preference. But in terms of what they are, they're essentially the same, or they're very similar for what they will do actually in the paint, speeding up the drying time, being that they are alkyds. But I think it comes down to personal preference. And with great power comes great responsibility. Always use less than you think you need, because you can always add more if you realize that the 2 drops wasn't enough for, let's say, your titanium white. Next time you paint, you add 3 drops in an underpainting. Start small, and over each layer of paint or through each subsequent painting that you do, you'll get more and more used to what the drying time is when you add a little compared to adding a lot. And I think regardless, you should always add less as opposed to more, because adding too much of any oil or medium can cause disastrous things for your painting. You put so much love and time into researching painting artist techniques, and also doing the grunt work, actually doing the paintings. Nobody wants to see their paintings fall apart or yellow or crack. I've seen paintings yellow and crack within my lifetime, in short years from doing the wrong thing. And that's why I'm a little crazy about all of this archival stuff, is because I don't want it to happen to me, and I certainly don't want it to happen to anyone else. All right. Hi, Brenda. How are you doing? Brenda asks, in your practice, would you use anything with an alkyd base like Liquin? Yes. When I'm using an alkyd, my primary choice is called epoxide oil. It's that copolymerized linseed oil from natural pigments. That is not going to speed up the drying time a lot, though. It'll hasten it a little bit, but it won't make a wild difference. For example, Liquin and Galid will speed up the drying time almost too fast, and I don't like that, because I'm patient and I'm working on lots of paintings anyway. But the epoxide oil I use in a way as a fast drying alternative to vacuum bodied linseed oil. When I say vacuum bodied linseed oil, that's the more proper name for stand oil. In the 21st century, we're not really using real stand oils, which is when you quite literally just let linseed oil sit there, kind of open air for a long time, a long time until it becomes high viscosity. The old term stand oil is much inferior compared to our vacuum bodied linseed oil, or the common stand oil that we have in today's world, which is polymerized without going through any oxidation. So vacuum bodied linseed oils are linseed oils that are heated in the complete absence of oxygen, and that essentially leads to a polymer, or a polymerized linseed oil. The epoxide oil is a copolymer, meaning there's more than one, there's more than one polymer in there. The epoxide oil will slightly hasten the drying time without taking it too far. So for example, I'll add stand oil to my raw and burnt umber, sometimes cobalt blues and lead whites. Meanwhile, I would add epoxide oil to titanium whites, cadmium reds, vermilions, bone black, which could use a little bit of an oomph in terms of drying. If you're not a fan of using bone black, I suggest going to something like a natural oxide black that does dry quickly and isn't quite as susceptible to cracking. Okay. Could you use oleoresin gel to dilute your paint for a dead color as opposed to a solvent? I think that the oleoresin gel is a little stickier than I like. I would just use regular epoxide oil. Otherwise, I would use just a tiny bit of oleo gel. I'm not a huge fan of using solvents. What happens is when you use a lot of solvent, mineral spirits, turpentine, in your paint, it causes the oil to get sucked up into your underlying paint layers or your ground more so. In other words, it leads to more sinking in. I dislike sinking in. I think we all dislike sinking in who have painting experience. I think that using either the polymerized oil, vacuum bodied linseed oil, stand oil, or the epoxide oil can hasten or slow down that drying time, but also lead to less sinking in. I don't like solvents due to their toxicity, and they just cause sinking in. Yeah, they spread the paint a little bit easier, but how many times have you done an underpainting or done just a regular painting with a solvent like that, and all's going well until that solvent really evaporates, and then the paint almost becomes unworkable. It stiffens up because a lot of that oil is either spread too far or sucked into the ground. That's just my personal opinion about the use of the solvent, though. Diane, does that answer your question good? Okay, Brenda also asks, also, if I did not cover it, would love some advice on the bubble as well. Okay, Brenda sent a couple of things that I'm going to pull up. Just give me 1 second, Brenda. I just want to pull up those photos if that would be okay with you.
So enthusiastic.
Just 1 moment. Sorry, I just went to the wrong email. Oh, here we go. Okay, Brenda, is what So we have a couple of things going on. Love the frame, by the way. That's beautiful. We have one area where your varnish seemed to kind of beat up and not take in this one small area. And then in the other photos, I can't see it quite as well, but do you have a couple of bubbles in your varnish? Brenda, are you still there? Oh, I think we lost Brenda, so I will. I'll answer this. I'll answer this just in case she watches the recording. If you have an area in your painting that this happens in the varnish, you have a couple of options. One of them that beforehand, maybe a little bit of a kind of prophylactic thing that you could do to avoid this from happening. I personally like to let my paintings dry for as long as I possibly can. I'm not just going to say 6 months because that's the broad general answer of how long you should probably let your painting dry before you varnish it. If you're using very fast drying pigments, you can usually varnish your painting in under 6 months, but 6 months is a good all around waiting time for your painting to really cure before varnishing. Sometimes you have this happen. That usually happens in areas where a little too much oil is used and you have a little bit of a glassy surface. And sometimes it happens even when you haven't used any extra oil. It just has a different, the surface tension, very similar to why you would wax your car to make the water beat off of it. Sometimes that very smooth, resistant surface can cause this to happen. Also, sometimes static electricity can make this happen. For example, if you were to use, I don't know, a rag, a paper towel, and wipe your painting a bunch, sometimes you can kind of charge your painting with a little bit of static electricity, which will actually make your varnish kind of resist on an area. That's very important also when priming surfaces, especially surfaces like aluminum composite material. You have the option to unvarnish the entire painting and revarnish it. My suggestion, once your painting is very dry, is to wipe it down with mineral spirits, especially if you have an area that you know is problematic. Taking something like a hog bristle brush and actually scrubbing that area with some of that mineral spirits can help roughen that surface. Of course, you need to be very, very careful. You can unvarnish the entire painting and revarnish it. Otherwise, you can take a cotton swab, which I've had to do this in places. Take a cotton swab and just use mineral spirits and remove the varnish and try to equalize this area. Let that mineral spirits evaporate, and then with surgical precision, reapply varnish with a regular, soft paintbrush. It's very important that you don't overlap other areas because then you'll see that spot. Sometimes it's best to unvarnish the whole thing, but I have had quite a bit of success actually just unvarnishing a little section and really making sure that that is clean, doesn't varnish, and then reapplying a bit of the varnish using just a regular like sable brush or a cheap soft synthetic. When it comes to a bubble, if this is bubbles in the varnish itself, most frequently I think bubbles in varnish, when you varnished, are caused by either you took your varnish and you shook it up, and then you poured it out and you used it. And you essentially, got air bubbles inside that varnish when you're applying it. Or your varnish was made at too high of a viscosity or it's too thick. And if you either A, shaken it up and introduced oil to that varnish, or B, used a kind of like a hog bristle brush, a thick wiry brush, that sometimes allows air bubbles to kind of get into your paint. And then, of course, that varnish dries quickly as it should, and sometimes seals some of those air bubbles actually inside the varnish.
Eric, this is Brenda. I'm just, that is not just the varnish layer. It appears to be coming from underneath the linen surface. It's really weird.
Really?
And I let that painting dry for 10 months.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know what are all of these things air bubbles, these little bumps?
No, those are
Are you
lint that
talking
I just
pretty much
couldn't
about
get
this
off. No, I'm talking about the long oblong right there. Yep.
Is this a stretch canvas or is this a panel?
It's a panel. It's a Rembrandt panel.
Can you touch the bubble? Can you like press
Yes.
and
Yeah.
bring to it?
It's flexible, and I didn't know if I should take a syringe and pierce it with a fine needle syringe. I really didn't know how to handle it.
If you said it's a Raphael panel,
Yes.
or the ones on a wood substrate.
Yes.
I think it probably has something to do with the adhesion of the linen to the panel. Nothing that you did, but more so the manufacturer of the panel. I would encourage you to reach out to them and ask them what they use as an adhesive. Because if they used something like a Biva film, there's a good chance that you could essentially dry mount press your painting.
What does
And
that mean?
that to adhere back to there. Biva film is used by conservators to reline paintings because the glue is dissolvable at a temperature that is not damaging to your oil painting. So I would contact them, maybe even get some better photos at a side.
Yeah.
And ask them what's up with this, because I don't think it's if you feel that spring, it sounds to me like there's some poor adhesion on one small area.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Can you varnish again over a previously varnished painting? Susan asked, can you varnish again over a previously varnished painting, especially if the painting looks sunken in? You can, but it greatly depends on what varnish you've actually used. For example, if you used a Regal Res 1094 varnish, which is what you see when you use Gamvar or use something like Natural Pigments Conservar varnish. The reason that I would choose the Conservar or the Regal Res 1094 varnish is because it doesn't cross-link over time. Now, natural resins like Damer or Damar have the tendency to cross-link. So the solvent, so let's pretend we're making varnish right now. I have Damar or Damer resin, and I dissolve it in turpentine. Bring the two together, and now it's a liquid, high viscosity, it's a varnish. When I varnish that, and I let it sit for 50 or 100 years, that varnish, that natural resin will cross-link. What that essentially means is that you are not going to be able to dissolve that varnish or that same resin with the same solvent. Turpentine will no longer dissolve it, but instead it would require a more polar solvent like toluene, xylene, acetone, isopropyl alcohol, more polar solvents in general to just dissolve that varnish away. And that's why conservation goes through such great lengths if they have to remove a varnish to not actually damage the painting, because those more polar solvents will also not only dissolve the varnish resin, but it will also dissolve the linoxin or the cross-linked dried linseed oil or whatever oil of you're choosing that's holding your pigments together. So some small damage happens to the painting. I prefer to use Regal Res 1094 Conservar or Gamvar varnish because it doesn't cross-link with time. Meaning I mix up my varnish. Let's once again pretend that we're mixing up our varnish. I have Regal Res 1094 resin. I have mineral spirits, high flash, fast evaporating mineral spirits, and then a little bit of a UV stabilizer, which will elongate the lifespan of that varnish to kind of thwart off yellowing and cracking of that varnish. I mix those together, mineral spirits, resin. I varnish my painting now. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, my varnish is dirty. It's protecting the painting. It's its main job is to protect the painting outside of the aesthetic reasons to make it look fresh and beautiful again. But I can dissolve that. I can remove that varnish with the same mineral spirits. Just like I can wipe down my painting with mineral spirits that's been dry for a year. Because the mineral spirits won't really dissolve my paint. For example, though, if you were to try and wipe your painting down with mineral spirits that's been dry for 5 days, that's going to be a very rude awakening and all your paint is going to go with it. That's why I choose Gamvar. If you've used Gamvar or Conservar and it looks sunken in, it probably would be a good idea to unvarnish it before you revarnish it if you really want that varnish to look good. The reason being, the same solvent used to make the varnish the first time you did it is going to be the same solvent that you're using the next time. So on one hand, you can do 2 layers of that varnish. And as you're doing 1 layer of varnish, you're also dissolving the first layer of varnish, which can make it look patchy. If instead you did a isolating varnish, for example, if you use one of the, let's say if you use like a Laropol varnish or one of the Polaroid series resins that you can make varnishes out of, those are dissolved. Those resins are dissolved by a much more polar solvent, sometimes toluene, xylene, sometimes a mixture of solvents that include non-aromatic solvents like mineral spirits. Those many times are not dissolved by mineral spirits alone. So you could do an isolating layer and then do Regal Res 1094 on top of it. And you won't have any of that patchiness. But I prefer, as an oil painter, to avoid some of those other varnishes, although they have good attributes of long lifespan, low yellowing, low susceptibility to cracking, because the inevitable outcome of a varnish is to get dirty and to protect your painting. I want my varnishes to be easily removed and to be as little damaging as possible by the conservator, who hopefully is taking care of, hopefully my work is worthy of being taken care of a few hundred years from now. But in today, when you're doing it, those are some of the questions that need to be kind of addressed or answered beforehand. So it's not like a very simple, not a very simple answer, but if you're using something like Regal Res 1094, you'll probably want to remove the previous varnish and revarnish it.
Thank you, Eric.
You're very welcome. All right, Jean Keller asks, I've noticed that
I think I double crossed with Susan's question because you sort of just answered it, except how do I take it off?
Mineral spirits and Q-tips rolled I mean, I'll give you the right answer and then I'll give you the practical answer. The right answer is get yourself some conservation Q-tips and dip in mineral spirits, and you want to roll the Q-tips. You don't want to scrub the Q-tips. You don't want to like scrub at your painting because that can damage it. To be very honest, though, I think the majority of people will just soak a rag with mineral spirits and gently wipe their painting down a few times with clean, a clean rag soaked in mineral spirits, or just
Yeah.
damp, not wet, but damp in mineral spirits. You can get rid of the majority of the varnish that way, although that is definitely more damaging to the painting. But
So by mineral spirits, Gamsol, is that okay? Or do I need to?
Gamsol is fine. There's only, I think, 6. All of the mineral spirits in the world come from, I believe, I think around 6, under 10 manufacturers. Because you have to think, we have crude oil, and then that goes somewhere, and they distill the crude oil into our gasoline, our jet fuel, all the things. And of course, Gamsol, odorless mineral spirits, is essentially, we're going back to oil, we're going back to crude oil. It's a distillate of that, which is another reason why it's good to keep it out of your everyday practice. Because I'm sure nobody would really want to be huffing, distillates of crude oil, as they're getting creative. My suggestion is, whenever using those solvents, always good ventilation is essential for your health. I mean, just health concerns by themselves. But yes, Gamsol is just mineral spirits. Your terpenoid is just mineral spirits. The same mineral spirits that you'll get from the art store will be the same mineral spirits that you get from, essentially, that you get from the hardware store. Many times it's the same mineral spirits that's rebranded. Of course, there are slightly different mineral spirits, some that evaporate very quickly, some that evaporate more slowly, some that are more pungent smelled, and some that are less. But just mineral spirits would do. I think that buying it from don't try to save a buck by buying it from a hardware store. Get it from a good place still. Julia asks or says, "Hi, Eric. Thanks for answering all the questions. I'm very intent on painting with the least amount of toxicity possible. So without solvents, and I'm also trying to minimize the use of pigments known to be toxic. Which pigments would you avoid? What substitutes for those pigments are best in your experience? Generally, could you speak about pigment toxicity?" I treat every single pigment as extremely toxic, every single one, because we can eat linseed oil, flaxseed oil. We can't eat any of our pigments. You have makeup where you've got titanium dioxide and it comes out later, or even Skittles that have excessive amounts of titanium dioxide, which are toxic. And I wouldn't even consider titanium dioxide to be high on the toxicity list. I would treat everything as extremely toxic. Now, to avoid the most toxic ones, stay away from your leads, stay away from your vermilions, even stay away from your cadmiums. Cadmiums nowadays are different than cadmiums were in the 19th century. Cadmiums nowadays are a little bit more resilient. If you accidentally ingest some cadmium red, you'll likely just pass it, as opposed to before, where you have unbound cadmium, and you can have, a form of cadmium that your body can essentially absorb. That's the problem with lead white, especially ingestion of lead white. Lead white is very susceptible to acids, and of course, in our digestive system is hydrochloric acid. So with that in mind, we want to make sure that whatever pigments that we're using also, they have differing levels of toxicity based on how you get in contact with them. I always wear gloves. I wear black gloves because white gloves and blue gloves shine on my fresh, wet painting. So I wear black gloves. I don't eat or drink while I'm in my painting mode. I don't leave my studio without taking off my gloves. I also have a home studio, or I had a home studio. in between homes right now. But when having my home studio, I also had a child running around, and we never had any problems just because I would treat everything as extremely toxic when it comes to, making paint that's only done in a space outside of my living space with full face respirator that will get rid of any of those kind of particulates. So after having a child, I didn't really make as much paint. So just for the reasons of not having a paint making studio with proper ventilation and things like that. But pigments that have a lower toxicity, I wouldn't consider any of them non-toxic, but lower toxicity, you can use nickel. I can't remember the exact name of it, but there's some nickel yellows that can be used as a replacement for your cadmiums. There is things like pyrrole red, which can be used as an alternative to cadmium. Your quinacridones, I believe, aren't terribly toxic. Same with your alizarin crimson, which is made from a synthetic, a synthetic version of the dye stuff. White, your titanium white is fine. I suggest using barium sulfate or barite to amend it and make it more transparent or less high tinting strength. For your black, bone black isn't much of a concern, but you could switch to using natural oxide black for faster drying, greater opacity, and less cracking. Slightly lighter, not quite as rich and dark. Ultramarine's no big deal. Stay away from it, since you're being very careful. I'd even say stay away from your cobalt-based pigments, although I haven't read of any cobalt-based toxicity, from a painter. But you don't have cobalt in your your pantry, so stay away from cobalt. Prussian blue, I think, would be fine. Ultramarine would be fine. Your umbers, your earth tones, just because it's an earth tone doesn't mean it's not toxic. For example, if you were to use a mineral pigment called orpiment or realgar, those are arsenic sulfide pigments, which is terrifying. We don't usually use those anymore, but I have seen them just carelessly handled. For example, I went into like a mineral, you go to the mall and sometimes there's those like crystal stores where they've got all of these cool rocks and fossils and things like that, and they had orpiment just in a glass case, just with dust everywhere. And I identified it and looked, I was like, that's not just sulfur, that's orpiment, which is an arsenic based pigment. And they confirmed it and had to get rid of everything, which is terrifying, because every single time someone would open up this cabinet, they'd get a heavy dose of the sulfury smelling pigment. But your raw, your burnt umbers, your siennas, your ochres, you should be fine, as long as you're not wearing them as war paint and chewing on your brushes and things like that. But proper ventilation is really most needed when you're using solvents and dealing with sanding your painting, which you shouldn't do, or making pigment, making paint from pigment and oil. I always like to have a HEPA filter in my studio just to get rid of the insidious amount of dust, that just finds its way to your sticky painting. But there are choices for oil paint with less toxicity. But the greatest toxicity, I think, comes from mishandling of the paint, being tidy, being very kind of clean about your space. That will take care of a lot of any potential risks of toxicity. One other question that I'm seeing, Julia, did that answer your question pretty good?
Yeah, just confirmed a lot of things that I had read online, and I live in a small apartment and I try to be tidy there, but I'm not the tidiest of people. I do wear gloves and stuff. But thanks for, yeah, you answered my question.
So long as you're it's really you should be as careful as you are. You should be even more careful. Just like if I get burnt umber on an area, if it's a house, I clean it to the same degree that I would if I got lead there. I think it's proper to have that level of care when it comes to tidiness and toxicity. That will never, you'll never go wrong, because a lot of the danger that we are in as artists is in long-term chronic exposure. It's you accidentally touched you accidentally touched your door handle with lead white on your hand, and then you take your gloves off, and then the next time you touch it again, then you go eat something, now it's in the kitchen, now little bits of it have spread everywhere. That's where wearing gloves, cleaning up spills in your studio that might have gotten on the floor promptly, so you're not also stepping it all over the place. But so long as you're taking proper precautions like that, you're not chewing on your paint brushes, and you're not having like a coffee mug that you have. If I have a mug of coffee or water, I'm a little wasteful with gloves. I hate to say it, but I take off my gloves and I enjoy my coffee. I take my well-deserved break. I glove back up with brand new gloves. If I get paint all over my gloved hands, I do not continue painting and getting paint all over my brushes, because we feel safe later touching our brushes without gloves, right? Sometimes we'll pick up our brushes and organize them. Meanwhile, those brushes can be quite contaminated with trace amounts of toxic pigments. So I do my best to not only wear gloves, but also if I've got a bunch of paint on my gloves, I just toss the gloves out. I just get rid of them and put fresh gloves on, because it gets on your brushes roll around, you carry them around, you go for a trip, you're picking them up, you're handling them. It's a recipe for disaster. So I'm really crazy with it. I take the same approach, I think, as you, concerning myself with toxicity. Meanwhile, I use some of the most toxic pigments and get checked and all this well. So that's all good. Common sense, reasonable common sense. And you really could use very toxic pigments so long as you're using good common sense. I don't think you should have much to worry about. But I completely support the expelling any toxic pigments, very toxic pigments, hazardous to your health from your palette. That's just a great idea.
Thanks for making me feel like I'm not the only crazy obsessive person.
No, everyone should be, because our health, what's the point if our health is going to suffer? We all deserve to live long lives where we can enjoy and love and make beautiful art. And I can't imagine a worse fate for an artist than to suffer for your decisions earlier in life and not being as careful as you should. Okay, another one. Is it all right to wipe your painting with isopropyl alcohol to avoid patches while varnishing? Never wipe your painting with isopropyl alcohol or acetone or anything of the sorts. Don't do that. You will cause many problems that you don't want to deal with. Now, if you have a glass palette and you have some paint that's dried on that glass palette, or some paint that's dried on your paintbrushes, I think that using isopropyl alcohol can be good, because it will dissolve. It'll dissolve the linox, it'll dissolve the oil that is pretty much holding that pigment together. So that can be used to clean your palette really well, but don't ever let it come in contact with the painting that you really care about. Winsor and Newton makes a cadmium-free yellow, orange, and red, and artist grade all around the same price. Oh, that's great. So Winsor and Newton's doing their due diligence in terms of the toxicity. Thank you, Becky. Carol asks, oh, this is a long one. Do you have any recommendations for conventions, events, meetups that are in person versus online? Looking particularly to, hi, Carol, by the way, hi. Looking particularly to create a community and meet other artists, see others work in person, and develop a more objective assessment of my own works and its strengths, weaknesses, and where I need to develop. It looks like there used to be a face convention, but not sure if it has come back since COVID. Workshops are great too, but those are much smaller in scale. That's a bit of a oh, Julie also says she gets her lead levels tested every single year, and all is well with Julie. I'm gonna thumbs
Yeah,
up
and
that
I'm
one.
not trying to be rude or anything about the small scale. I appreciate those. I think especially for some of us that are rural or we aren't living by an atelier. I'm always trying to gauge, like, am I painting too thin? Am I painting too thick? And you just can't do that when you never see anyone else's work in person.
Yeah, that's a tough question because everyone's lives and locations are kind of unique. I think a great place to look is locally first, to see if you can find any veteran artists, studio, somebody who has a lot of experience that either teach out of their studio or have meetups. No matter where you go, is rural or urban, there's always a little art community to be found somewhere where they're doing live model drop-ins and things like that. I would encourage you to look within an hour drive of you for any type of art studio where you can actually be face to face and meet with people on somewhat of a regular basis.
Yes.
It's also important to vet this to vet the community that you're trying to kind of go into, because if their ideals and the type of work that they do are not in alignment with yours, you may be met with more of an unwelcoming, harshly critiquing or judging type of artistic community, which it doesn't feel very good when, as opposed to kind of like comradeship, camaraderie. It's more people trying to feed their own egos or make themselves look better by talking down on your artwork. There are things like the face convention, the Portrait Society's convention every single year. There's also just look at galleries. I think that galleries are one of the best places to find like-minded people, because at least most of the galleries that I've gone to, I've seen more artists in gallery showings than just admirers and collectors in many cases. That going to gallery openings, I think, is an excellent way to get out there, see the way things work, and also meet the artists that are there. I think striking up candid, casual conversations on social media is another great way, especially if you find some artists that are showing in your general vicinity. And if you kind of talk with them beforehand and then go to their show or whatever it may be, I think that could be a good way or a good beginning into surrounding yourself with like-minded individuals who not only excel on the journey or are farther in the journey than you are, and at this current point, that can offer insight to you, but also just being able to bounce ideas off of somebody. Everybody's so unique that you never know exactly what you get. There's no worse feeling than meeting an artist that you really admire and finding out that they're not as great of a person as you had in your head. But you know, everyone's lives are complicated, I guess. Did that answer your question, Kara?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Julie says meetups are great. Find artists who are local-ish that you like their work and reach out and start a dialogue. Yeah, exactly. Oh, Nicole also suggests meetup.com can be a good one. Was there any other questions? Wow, we've been going for a while here. Does anybody else have any other questions? Anything you want to talk about? Give me 1 second, let me press the chat. Nicole asks, what do you use for a canvas/surface? I'm always of two minds with cheaper versus greater quality because I never know if my painting will get more serious. I think if you are okay with doing some prep work, the cheapest and best surface that I could recommend would be using something like a lead alkyd ground on a piece of aluminum composite material or an ACM panel. I would suggest Googling a local sign supplier. That is where you will find the ACM panels. You can even get it from Amazon and Home Depot if you order online. What you can do is you can cut those panels up with even a utility blade, sand it, wipe it down, and then 2 layers of a lead alkyd ground. No, they don't need to be sanded. The lead alkyd ground does not need to be sanded. You do 1 layer, let it dry for 1 to 2 days, and then do another layer and then let it dry for 2 weeks, and you're good to go. I did a 5 by 10 altarpiece painting, 5 feet by 10 feet painting. I got a 5 by 10 foot corrugated core ACM panel. I sanded it with an electric sander, not to the point where I sanded through. You should get a white, you know, you'll find ACM panels that are painted white with like a, oh, I don't know the exact type of paint, if it's like an epoxy or whatever it is. You don't want to completely sand through that layer, the white painted layer. You want to wipe that down with isopropyl alcohol, and you want to let it sit for a while because all of that wiping and sanding will create a lot of static electricity. So what you want to do is just let it sit for a while, and then you can roll it on using a high density foam roller. And the lead alkyd ground that Natural Pigments makes is kind of fresh. It's good to go straight out of like the jar. Do 1 layer, let it dry for a day or 2 till it's dry to the touch. Do another layer, let it dry for 1 to 2 weeks, and then you're good to paint. That is the quickest and cheapest, but also the best surface that I can recommend. You don't have to deal with gluing, air bubbles, kind of like Brenda is dealing with, and that's come from the manufacturer, those air bubbles. I've glued many linens, a lot of canvas onto these panels of wood and ACM, but many times you get a little bubble. You get a brush hair under it and it shows through. You have to weight it down. There's lots of variables that go into it. I'm actually really liking just rigid substrates like the ACM and then just priming those substrates. Those actually, I actually quite like, and they're very inexpensive. You know, for me, the 5 by 10 panel, I think was under $200. I mean, we're talking 5 feet wide by 10 feet tall. That also includes the delivery. So that was excellent. You usually can say, I need raw ACM panels. I want 8, you get a piece of paper, you draw out how big the panel is. Usually they're 4 feet by 8 feet. And you draw out how many 16 by 20s can fit in a 4 by 8, how many 8 by 10s. You do the math, and then you send that to the place, and they'll usually cut them for you, and you can just pick them up. And then you've got 28 by 10s, 19 9 by 12s, 5 18 by 24s. And then you just need to just sand them, prime them. You make like a whole production line out of it, and then you're essentially good to go for quite a while. And it saves you the $1,000 roll of linen as well on top of it.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. What thickness do you recommend for the ACM panels? I recommend the thin ones, around 3 millimeters for just everyday use. Once they get bigger, you can go to the 5 or 6 millimeter thickness. We're talking about the solid core. That's a solid polyethylene core. It's like it's kind of a little plasticky. You can really kind of like bend it if you really try hard. If your paintings get over 20 by 30, I think that you need to go up in thickness or switch over to the corrugated core, which is a corrugated polypropylene core. That'll be very rigid and very light. For example, when I did my recent altarpiece, it was a 5 by 10 panel, but I could lift it and move it around all by myself easily. And that's amazing to be able to do, because if it was wood, it would be difficult to find 5 feet by 10 feet, and B, it would just be extremely heavy and also put a lot of burden in terms of weight on the actual wooden altarpiece, or in your case, framing it and just hanging these things on the wall. But the ACM panels are really lightweight and really good. Next question is, did Rembrandt use round brushes because that's all that was available? Did Rembrandt use round brushes because that's all that was available, or because preferred them, or both? Probably both. Prior to the 19th century, that's pretty much the only brush type that you had available to you was a round brush. Many times they're just wire wax thread tied brushes. Sometimes you'll have brushes with using a goose feather as a ferrule, or a crow feather as a ferrule, where it's a wax tied brush. I have seen instances where there are multiple round brushes in rows, kind of like this, that come together to create a large flat brush. But in medieval art and Renaissance art, you could generally say that the overwhelming majority of brushes that would have been used would have been round brushes. And I personally really love round brushes. I think that every painter should go through certain phases where they do paintings using a limited type of brush. Try to do brushes with only filberts. Try to do paintings with only filbert style brushes. Try to do paintings with only flat brushes. Try to do paintings with only round brushes as the 3 main ones: flats, rounds, and filberts. Stay there. So you can really explore what those brushes are capable of, larger and smaller. There's also the option of going longer and shorter haired. For example, a long-haired round is called a script brush or a rigger. A short-haired flat is called a bright. A long-haired filbert is long-haired filbert. Maybe there's a special name for it, like an Egbert. But I think that it's a good idea to explore what type of marks can each of those brushes make. And of course, you can do that all at the same time, but I personally needed more simplicity, and I found it more helpful to just do, for example, when I was doing a lot of like Rembrandt copies, I would only use round brushes and riggers. And I came much closer to achieving the same type of look than I did when I was trying to do a Rembrandt with fan brushes and filberts. How much do you sand through the white layer that it comes with? Very lightly. You don't need to sand it much. You just need to break up the very glass or very smooth and shiny surface. It should look matte by the time you're done sanding it, but you shouldn't see metal when you're sanding it. So like I don't know, a 220, 240 grit sandpaper usually should be fine. Maybe even a little bit finer, 360, something along those lines. You're very welcome, Nancy. Do you, Diane asked, do you sand the glossier side? If there is a glossier side, maybe. It depends. They come in so many different finishes. I would just sand a painted side. That's just what I would say. Does anybody have any other questions before we conclude our first AMA?
So I buy panels 10 minutes down the road from me, and they cut them up for me.
Wonderful.
And they are white, but they're white on both sides, and one side is glossier and then the other side. So I just figured the glossier side was probably better to sand as opposed to the not glossy side.
I don't know. I think it would be safe to just sand the glossy side. That's probably what I would do. Because I probably wouldn't
But the
feel
non-glossy
safe.
side,
I probably wouldn't feel safe just priming on the unglossy side, but I'm sure if they're the same relative thickness, you could sand the unglossy side and see how that works. You can do some tests as well where you prime it, let it dry, and then take something like a ballpoint pen with a lot of pressure and try to really gouge into it and see if the paint will like shatter or flake off. That can give you a kind of idea of how good of an adhesion you have once that primer is really dry. So get it next time, take one of the pieces that's like an 8x10 and prime both sides. Do sand, sand both sides of them, prime them, and then do some tests to try and mess it up.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Thanks everybody for coming to our first social hangout question and answer extravaganza.
I hope you all enjoyed it and hope you all got something out of it.
And this is a link that everybody can use for next month too, right? So it's not like they have to re-register for it.
Yep, you can use the same link for every single one of these AMAs, which will always be on the first Sunday of the month at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the time's going to be the same. The link, you only need to register once. And as more of these come up, we may send out like a reminder email just in case you lose the link. But yeah.
Yeah, and so the reminders, if you're registered, you'll receive that reminder. But if you're interested in the school in general and like what was going on at the school or if what workshops are coming up, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter. And so next month I'll be hosting. I don't have the same level of technical knowledge that Eric does, but I have different layers of expertise. So I hope to see most of you there. And just keep a log of what questions you have for people, and then we'll see you next month.
All right. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you so
Take
much. This was
care.
amazing.
Thank
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Take care. I will see all of you Atelier students soon.